kind of like my introduction. So reminder, I'm starting off with what trauma is and who has it. So as some of you probably already know, I'm expecting particularly Crispin will know, that the word trauma, it's originally from Greek, meaning wound. And it's very apt because a traumatic experience itself can be wounding, physically wounding, emotionally wounding, but it also can result in ongoing trauma where the impact of the initial traumatic experience has ongoing physiological or psychological or emotional impact. So that wound remains there and is embodied by the person who has experienced the trauma. So, and that's generally the sense in which I'll be talking about trauma as being that ongoing impact following a particular event or a series of events. We do hear kind of like a colloquial use of the word trauma these days, which, you know, people say things like, oh yeah, you know, I went out and my friend was really horrible to me and I was traumatized by the experience. We're not talking about it in that sense. We are, you know, this is about people who've experienced actually very difficult life events. Gabor Mate, and I'm just going to read this quote. He says, trauma is a psychic injury lodged in our nervous system, mind and body, and lasting long past the originating incident or incidents, triggerable at any moment. And that last part is important because we talk in coaching terms about triggers, and often when people present with a coaching issue, underline that can be because they've been triggered by something, or the thought of doing something is quite triggering for them. So that's what we're, you know, is important from a coaching perspective. And what Gabor Mate goes on to say is that because of this physiological and psychological wounding, our body adapts and accommodates that wound. And so there can be ways in which we hold ourselves physically that demonstrate that. So, for example, you know, you may see people who kind of like constantly are sort of more hunched over, and that, you know, maybe they often hold their head on one side. Not always, but, you know, that can be a sign of maybe some physical or emotional abuse that they've experienced. So they're holding themselves small, not wanting to really project out into the world. You know, the other one that I always remember this long before I even thought about training as a coach, but I used to work with a chap who he always used to have his chin out like this, and particularly if I had a particularly thorny HR challenge for him, you know, sort of to say what I thought he should or shouldn't do in a particular situation, and the risks that he might be presenting to the company, the chin would always come out. And I often thought at the time, there's something there about, you know, how that chin pops out. What does that represent? Is it sort of, you know, hard man? He's learned that from somewhere, or he's learned that if he pushes his chin out, you know, people back down. I didn't, obviously, but some people would in the face of that kind of embodiment. So, and what happens then is that we are kind of, you know, mental thinking, which is something that Jamie's talked about already, that, you know, what our thoughts conjure up can be influenced by these physical or psychological wounds that we're continuing to hold. And it's sort of, you know, there's that sense of nursing the wound and holding the scar because that is familiar, because that's more comfortable. And, you know, we operate from that position. So some Nina is joining us. Just admitted her. So, and I think most of you will have come across the term big T and little t trauma. Just give me a kind of, you don't need to use the thing, but yeah, most of you have heard of that terminology. So, psychologists tend to distinguish between big and little t trauma. So, big T trauma is things, sort of big events that most people would consider, the man in the street or woman in the street would consider shouldn't have happened to an individual. So, for example, the experience of, children in Ukraine at the moment would be considered a big T trauma because, war is being inflicted on them. Obviously, there might be another perspective if we were in Russia, but just taking it from a Ukrainian perspective for now, it could be something like physical or sexual abuse in childhood, where I'm sure everybody present here would recognise that as something that shouldn't happen to that vulnerable person, but all too frequently does happen. And then small t trauma is sort of maybe less obviously traumatic, less obviously wrong, even, in the sense that it can occur in situations, for example, where a parent might be critical of their child because they think that's the way to train them to be a better person or to behave appropriately in certain circumstances, or they may have expectations on their child to be a certain type of person and to express themselves in a certain way. The Judith Orloff speaks very eloquently about her experiences as a child. She's quite well known for her work on empaths and how empaths function and what they need in order to be successful in society. She describes herself as an empath, and yet she grew up in a home where that quality wasn't valued. And so her desire to just kind of like be with nature and enjoy kind of going with the flow, that wasn't really respected or honoured by her parents. They expected her to be more structured and focus on book learning and follow in their footsteps and dress in the way that they had, they did, wear suits and things like that. So, she has learned to come to terms with what that experience was for her, but nevertheless, that could be described as small t trauma, where the expectations on the child are very different from the capacity of the child to cope with them. So, and then there's also what I'm going to describe as indirect trauma. So where the experience hasn't happened directly to that individual, but where there is an impact that from somebody else's trauma. And there are some really significant studies around Holocaust survivors and their offspring, noting that the children of Holocaust survivors have significantly higher levels of cortisol compared to non-Holocaust offspring survivors' experience. So there's that genetic code that is transferred from people who've experienced big T trauma in the Holocaust that then is passed down through the generation, at least one generation, in some cases 2 generations. Mark Wallen, who wrote the book It Didn't Start With You,